Welcome everyone to the next part of the video series presenting Regulation 561. This regulation mostly discusses driving and rest periods, and we will go through every sentence, breaking it down into parts. We'll continue with Article 8, but I currently have Article 7 open in front of me because I owe something from the previous video. A paragraph was left out. Regulation 561 has been amended several times, and I had opened a version that did not contain the M for amendment in Article 7. I have often pointed out that we should always refer to the most up-to-date version. Unfortunately, I failed to do so this time. So, the third paragraph of Article 7 was left out. It refers to drivers engaged in occasional passenger transport. This provision states that the 45-minute break between driving periods can also be split into two breaks of at least 15 minutes each, as long as the rule mentioned in the first paragraph, no more than 4.5 hours of continuous driving, is followed. The basic requirement of a total 45-minute break still applies. So, what does this mean? You can split your break into any two parts of at least 15 minutes that suit your schedule. Examples: 20 plus 25 minutes, or 26 plus 19 minutes. This rule makes it easier for bus drivers to take their breaks flexibly. Let's move on to Article 8. The driver must observe daily and weekly rest periods. That is nothing new here. Let's examine how these rest periods must be observed. After the end of the previous daily or weekly rest period, a new daily rest must be taken within each 24-hour period. These are the 24-hour intervals. When you start your day, work, drive, and take breaks, the daily rest period must also fall within this 24-hour window. If the daily rest is at least 9 but less than 11 hours, it is considered a reduced daily rest period. So, if you can't fit an 11-hour rest into the 24-hour period, it will be a reduced daily rest. On the right side of the screen you can see the Trace 2 document. The Trace 2 document, issued by the European Commission to explain the rules of this regulation, confirms these interpretations. It is accepted as an official explanation by authorities and can be cited accordingly. Returning to Article 8, what are these 24-hour periods? They are not necessarily always exactly 24 hours. There are examples where a full 24-hour period fits perfectly, ending with a 9-hour daily rest period. That would be a reduced daily rest. However, these periods often end up being shorter than 24 hours. For example, if a driver starts their shift, drives for 4.5 hours, and then immediately takes a daily rest, that rest counts. When the next shift begins, a new 24-hour period also starts. This means that every valid daily or weekly rest marks the start of a new 24-hour period, regardless of whether the previous 24-hour period was fully used or not. There are examples to illustrate this, and understanding this is essential when thinking about whether a regular or reduced rest fits within a given period. The next part involves another M for amendment, which is a bit more complex and again concerns occasional passenger transport. Naturally, the regulation notes that such exceptions may only be applied if they do not compromise road safety or the driver's working conditions. Now to the point, we are talking about occasional passenger transport over a period of at least 6 consecutive 24-hour periods. This exception can only be applied if the transport activity spans at least 6 consecutive 24-hour periods. Within that period, deviation from the second paragraph's first subparagraph is allowed. Specifically, the daily rest can be taken within 25 hours instead of 24 from the end of the last daily or weekly rest. It is essential to emphasize that this exception can be applied only once, and only if the total driving time for the day does not exceed 7 hours. This is especially useful for bus drivers with extended programs that cause the shift to stretch beyond 24 hours, despite not involving much driving. Under the same conditions, this exception can be used twice if the transport activity spans at least 8 consecutive 24-hour periods. However, applying this exception must not cause the driver to exceed the maximum working time. Let's continue with the rules on rest periods. Can a daily rest period be extended into a regular or reduced weekly rest period? Yes. If a driver begins a daily rest but extends it, it becomes a regular or reduced weekly rest. Simply put, a 9-hour break might become 11, 11 might become 24, and 24 might become 45 hours. A rest of at least 45 hours counts as a regular weekly rest. Anything less than 45 but at least 24 hours is a reduced weekly rest. Between any 2 weekly rest periods, a driver can only take up to 3 reduced daily rest periods. This is often misunderstood. Many believe that you can have 3 reduced daily rests per week. That's not true. The regulation measures from weekly rest to weekly rest. If one weekly rest ends on Thursday and the next begins the following Tuesday, the driver can have 3 reduced daily rests in between. Each weekly rest resets the count. Now, paragraph 5. Contrary to paragraph 2, a driver operating as part of a multi-driver crew must take another daily rest period of at least 9 hours within 30 hours from the end of the previous daily or weekly rest. In multi-driver operations, i.e., with 2 drivers, these periods are 30 hours instead of 24. There is no distinction between reduced and regular daily rest in this context. The only requirement is that within the 30-hour period, at least 9 hours of rest must be taken. Next. Weekly rests. Within any 2 consecutive weeks, a driver must take at least 2 regular weekly rest periods. That means 45 hours of rest each week. Alternatively, the driver can take 1 regular and 1 reduced weekly rest of at least 24 hours. In driver terms, you can take advantage of the rule that allows 1 45-hour rest and 1 24-hour rest in consecutive weeks. The reduced weekly rest is at least 24 hours but less than 45. What else applies to weekly rest periods? The weekly rest period must begin no later than the end of 6 24-hour periods from the end of the previous weekly rest. Of course, if your driving or working hours are exhausted earlier in the week, you must stop and begin your weekly rest sooner. The reason for this is if you reach the maximum weekly driving time, bi-weekly driving time, or weekly working time. If none of those are reached, then the 6 times 24-hour rule, i.e., 144 hours, applies. Now come the newer allowances. It is possible to take 2 consecutive reduced weekly rest periods. The regulation states that, by way of derogation from the first subparagraph, a driver engaged in international transport may take 2 consecutive reduced weekly rests outside their home member state, provided that in any 4 consecutive weeks, at least for weekly rest periods are taken, of which at least 2 must be regular weekly rests. Translated into driver terms, you may take 2 24-hour weekly rests back to back. But here's the catch: the 4-week period must include 4 weekly rest periods, with at least 2 of them being 45 hours or more. If you do 24 plus 24, then the rest periods before and after must both be at least 45 hours. And be careful, the regulation states any 4 consecutive weeks. This means the authority may look at any rolling 4-week period. So, if your rest periods go 45, 24, 24, 45, you're fine. But if the next week you do another 24, the 4-week window now includes 24, 24, 45, 24, which only has 1 regular weekly rest. That would be a violation. Let's now look at what else is required for this benefit. The regulation specifies that to be considered an international transport driver eligible for this benefit, the 2 consecutive reduced weekly rests must be taken outside both the member state of the employer's establishment and the country of the driver's place of residence. So, if your employer is based in the Netherlands and your residence is also in the Netherlands, both of your reduced weekly rests must be taken outside the Netherlands. If the driver's residence is in Belgium and the employer is also Belgian, then any other country outside Belgium will qualify. However, if the driver resides in the Netherlands and the employer is Belgian, neither Belgium nor the Netherlands can be used to take these reduced weekly rests. Now let's visualize this on a timeline using the trace document. This document illustrates the 4-week period clearly. Week 1 includes a 45-hour rest, week 2 has a 24-hour reduced rest, week 3 includes another reduced rest, for the sake of the example, and week 4 finishes with another 45-hour regular rest. This shows that the law looks at the structure across any 4 consecutive weeks. If you shift the 4-week window, e.g., starting from week 2 to week 5, it still must meet the requirement for weekly rest periods with at least 2 being regular, at least 45 hours. So what you need to understand, and I'll talk more about compensation in a moment as we continue reviewing the regulation, is that when you look at this 4-week period, if I take this lens through which I'm examining it and shift it, say starting from week 2 to week 5, it still has to comply with the regulations requirement. There must be 4 weekly rest periods within that time frame, and at least 2 of those must be regular, meaning at least 45 hours each. The compensation for reduced rests will come up shortly, but now let's take a brief return to the topic of passenger transport. The regulation states that, by way of derogation from paragraph 6, a driver engaged in a one-off occasional passenger transport operation may postpone their weekly rest period by up to 12 consecutive 24-hour periods following the previous regular weekly rest. Provided that, and here the regulation lists various conditions which we'll also need to go over, because they are quite serious. What this refers to is the 6-day, i.e., 144-hour, rule mentioned in paragraph 6, which requires the next weekly rest to begin within 144 hours after the end of the previous one. In the case of occasional passenger transport, this may not be very practical, since you go on a trip and might be forced to take your weekly rest while on the road. What happens to the passengers then? So here comes the allowance. The legislator says that instead of 6 consecutive 24-hour periods, you get 12. But certain conditions must be met in exchange. What are these? After taking advantage of this exception, the driver must take 2 regular weekly rest periods, i.e., 45 hours each, or 1 regular weekly rest and 1 reduced weekly rest of at least 24 hours. So, either they take 2 45-hour breaks in one go, or they take 1 45-hour and 1 24-hour break, but that 24-hour rest, the reduction, must be compensated with an uninterrupted rest equivalent to the shortfall, taken before the end of the 3rd weekend following the end of the derogation period. The next condition is that the vehicle must be equipped with a digital tachograph in accordance with the regulation cited. While the mentioned EEC regulation has been replaced, it should now refer to Regulation 165/2014. The essential requirement remains: the vehicle must have a digital tachograph. Another condition: if driving takes place between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., considered higher risk periods, either there must always be more than one driver in the vehicle, or, here's the alternative, the maximum duration of driving as defined in Article 7 must be reduced to 3 hours. In other words, the maximum driving period can only be 3 hours long during those hours. Then there's a long sentence about how the Commission will later review all of this, prepare a report, and evaluate whether these provisions are appropriate. It also mentions the intention to digitize the entire process. We already see this with the CMR, and the possibility of digitizing the journey logbook is also under consideration. Now let's talk about compensation. If a weekly rest period is reduced, the missing hours must be compensated with an equivalent uninterrupted rest taken before the end of the 3rd week following the affected week. For example, if in week 1 you take a 24-hour reduced weekly rest, missing 21 hours to reach 45, you must make up for this 21-hour before the end of week 4. The compensation must be attached to another rest period and taken in full. Which rest periods can you attach the compensation to? Any, reduced or regular daily rest and reduced or regular weekly rest. In plain driver terms, that means you can attach it to a 9, 11, 24, or 45-hour rest. Now, how do you handle 2 consecutive reduced weekly rests? Both reductions must be compensated before the following regular weekly rest, and the compensation must precede that rest. Here's a detailed example from Trace. You finish week 1 with a 45-hour rest, then take 24-hour and 27-hour rests in weeks 2 and 3. If another 24-hour rest is inserted, for demonstration purposes, then the closest reduced rests to the following 45-hour regular rest must be compensated. So, 21 hours for the 24-hour rest, and 18 hours for the 27-hour rest, totaling 39 hours of compensation. This compensation must be completed before the next 45-hour rest begins, meaning, you need to calculate when that rest would begin and attach the 39 hours of compensation beforehand. Also, any compensation period must be linked to a rest of at least 9 hours. I've mentioned this before. Now for the social component of the rule. Regular weekly rest periods and compensated reduced weekly rest periods that last 45 hours or more may not be taken in the vehicle. These rests must be taken in accommodation with appropriate sleeping and hygiene facilities, with consideration for gender. And the bad news for employers, the cost of such accommodation must be borne by the employer. Next one. We arrive at the so-called 4-week rule. The employer must organize the driver's schedule so that within any 4 consecutive weeks, the driver can return to either the employer's operational center in the member state of establishment, the driver's place of residence. By the way, this is completely official. If a person can go home with the truck and park it at home, the regulation accepts that as well. Let's look at the next point. We had this derogation, or rather, a benefit, allowing 2 consecutive reduced weekly rest periods. There is still one more condition attached to it. If a driver has taken 2 consecutive reduced weekly rests under paragraph 6, the company must ensure that the driver returns before the start of the 45-plus-hour compensating rest. Not only must the driver be brought back, but the employer must also document how they complied with this obligation and retain the documentation at the premises for inspection. The next one is an important clarification from Article 8. A weekly rest period split across 2 weeks can only be counted toward one of those weeks, not both. For example, a 45-hour rest that starts on Saturday and ends on Monday can count for either week 1 or week 2, but not both. Finally, the last sentence of Article 8 gives a mandate to the Commission to assess and report to the Parliament and Council on whether more suitable rules for passenger transport should be adopted. That's enough for today, guys. The next topic will be Article 8A. If you have any questions about Article 8, feel free to leave a comment. I'll try to respond as soon as possible. And if you liked the video, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I also cover topics like dangerous goods transport, load securing, and anything else that might come up in road haulage. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Bye.